get started. Thank you. Thank you everyone for coming to this lunch event to make your time during your busy work day. We put this event together, Gaba and ACG. And first of all, I'd like to thank our host for providing this lovely space for us and hosting us for this lunch. And yeah, we're very happy about this talk today. This is obviously a very hot topic for the Germans and also for California. And yeah, would like to introduce you first of all to Olaf Groth. He's Gaba's chair for the Clean Tech Industry Group. Olaf is the CEO of Emergent Frontiers Group, where he's science responsible for EFG's key client relationship, its global development and affiliations. Over the past 20 years, he held senior advisory and executive roles in strategy, corporate, business, market and operations development, government relations and public policy with Monitor Group, Qualcomm, Boeing, Vodafone, AirTouch and a transportation startup. In these roles, he counseled clients and helped qualify, negotiate and develop new ventures and initiates in 30 and more countries with opportunity sizes between approximately $100 million to $2 billion. And Olaf is going to introduce our speaker today.
Thank you, Caroline. Welcome everybody to this lunch. I very much appreciate having such an illustrious group here today. We have a very diverse group of folks in the audience, and I hope that I can do my part in stimulating a very interesting and thought-provoking conversation. First of all, before I properly introduce Andreas Kraemer, let's welcome him as well. I had the good fortune of meeting him a couple of months ago in Berlin on the occasion of an ACG-sponsored energy and climate study group. One of the many examples of how ACG adds value to transatlantic relations. I don't know how many of you are ACG members. Can I get a raise of hands, maybe? Just a couple of you. I want to obviously say a few words before I go to Mr. Kraemer here on both organizations. Colleen and I, of course, are biased with regard to GABA since we're so heavily involved in it, but it is one of the key institutions on the West Coast, and in fact with a number of international offices that are affiliated that deal with global and transatlantic issues in which the German-California relationship might play a role. And it is focused on the local community here, so we're trying to offer events and content very much relevant to our local constituency wherever we are. And then, of course, ACG, one of the premier institutions that, as I outlined, I benefited from greatly in transatlantic relations. Any of you who are not yet members, I would encourage both of you to take a look at ACG as well, not just GABA. And see the caliber, which I think is represented on the website as well, of both VIPs that come and speak as well as members and publications. I'm very glad that we have a bit of a partnership going right now, and one of the results of that is obviously the visit by Mr. Kraemer here, who will endow us with his knowledge and his views on the energy transition in Germany. I'd like to make this conversation, obviously, in the first part anyway, focused on Germany, what's happening in Germany, what are the interpretations of what's happening in Germany in the European context, since energy is an inherently cross-border issue, and then broaden the conversation a little bit, and we talked about this earlier, to try to understand what that means for the United States. Are there any lessons learned, really both ways, and entertain your questions. We're going to try and make this as interactive as possible. So I'm going to start out introducing him, and then he will make about 10-12 minutes worth of comments, and then I'll stimulate a conversation. We'll make this very interactive because one of his goals here, openly stated, is to really hear from you, your reactions to what he's got to say. And engage you, and then actually flow some of the learning into the papers that he's writing, so that this becomes a bit of a co-creative exercise. I don't know how many of you know our guest speaker today. He's quite renowned in Germany, and as the director of the Ecologic Institute, not just the director, but really the founder. So he's a bit of a social entrepreneur, as well, and I'm going to invite him to speak a little bit about the origins of his institution, because I think it's sort of true to, you know, Silicon Valley entrepreneurship spirit and how he started this, bootstrapping it and living to his passions. He is an environmental engineer by training, and the reason for why I'm mentioning this is that he brings a very interdisciplinary view of energy to the table, which will hopefully, you will find, will make for a very realistic opinion on energy. He not only can speak to the high concept topics of energy and environmental policy, trade and economic development, but also on the nuts and bolts of environmental and energy systems. And I'll steer the conversation a little bit into both sides of that territory. Aside from running Ecologic, which incidentally has an office here in San Mateo, and we have his colleague here. I apologize, could you restate your name, please?
Tanya Subotny,
Yeah.
running the local office of Ecologic here in San Mateo.
Excellent. So beyond this conversation, you can obviously contact Tanya as well. So aside from running that institute, he's also a visiting professor at Duke University. He is co-chair of EcoWorld, which is a green investment criteria organization, if I
Well, we
characterize
have
that.
300 million euros under management.
So you're actually a managed fund.
Oh,
No, I don't manage the fund. I define the universe for the fund manager to operate within.
Got it. Very meaningful. He's on the board of Bellagio Forum for Sustainable Development, and previously was part of various research institutions in Germany, such as the Science Center Berlin, the Institute for Ecological Economy, and the Institute for European Environmental Policy, so he's very experienced in the field. So with that, I'll hand it off to him and let him sort of run the gamut a little bit, but maybe you could start off just inspiring us with how you founded this and then dive into your topics.
And you gave me 12 minutes. You know, when you ask a traveling salesman to talk about his shop, 12 minutes is never enough. I've put out some brochures, and those of you sitting in the second row, I'm sure we have more for all of you to take. Yes, what drove me is, you're right, I'm an engineer. I trained as an engineer and I went into the oil industry, and I realized very quickly that people were cavalier in the risks that they were taking. I was understanding that what these guys were doing in the production fields was dangerous. I realized that a number of obvious technical solutions to managing environmental risks and work hazard risks were not being adopted, and became interested in why that is. What drives decision making in business? Is it economics? Is it the law? Is it the culture of an organization? What explains the uptake of environmental technologies? And it's really that question that is still driving me today. You asked me about Ecologic Institute. I worked previous to that in the Institute for European Environmental Policy. It was closing, had nothing to do with me, it was simply closing. And I had 3 research projects lined up that had been evaluated, and it was clear that they would be funded. And if, as I've learned earlier, I'm not a person who is suitable for large organizations, I do not fit easily into hierarchical disciplines. So I was an entrepreneur, I knew that. But if at that point you're given 3 research projects, and at that stage you don't make the transition into establishing a business of sorts, then you would never do it. So that was the point when I decided to do it. Ecologic Institute, established 16 years ago in Germany, is a non-profit organization. It's a think tank. It's a research organization. When you hear that combination in the US, you think that there is a benefactor of last resort, that there's a sugar daddy foundation behind it or something like that. No. This organization works like a business. We raise all our funds in competitive sittings, so we submit proposals in competition with other research organizations or service providers. We work with support with grants, research grants or other grants from largely governmental organizations. About 80–85% of the revenue is from government sources. Slightly more than half is grants, slightly under half is contract research and policy consultancy work. We're very successful in raising research funds. That is why I say we're a research organization. We got, and that is a record in Europe, we got 62 projects out of 107 applications out of the European research funding mechanism. equivalent to the National Science Foundation. The average success rate is something like 5 to 8%. And we have a success rate that is by a factor of 8 to 10 higher than the average. So it shows you that we've found a niche there that we play. At the same time, the organization is the only German organization, think tank, that has 2 framework contracts with the European Parliament. So if the parliamentarians, the legislators in the European Parliament, if they have a question, they agree in committee across party lines on the questions that they would like to have answered. We write a fact-based report for them to educate, inform their discussions. So that in essence explains to you sort of the spread of what the Institute does. When it was established, yes, that was my own money that I put in, and no salary for the first year in order to pay off the debt for the initial investment and get it going. But today, 140 staff with 7 million euros, close to 10 million US dollars annual turnover. 4 years ago, we established a separate, legally and financially separate institution, 501c3 non-profit organization in Washington, D.C. For in the US, there can be no foreign-controlled non-profit organization. So that is why it is legally and financially separate. It's all set up under US law, but obviously we cooperate closely. We share the name, the logo, and the website. But nevertheless, there is a barrier in segmentation there as well. And last year we opened an office with Tanja Sopotniak as the head, currently employing 1.5 persons, and the development objective is to bring that up to 4 or 5 by the end of this year, depending on the project money we can bring in and other types of support. The objective is to be useful for California. And at this point I would like to say thanks to the United States and to California in particular, because the topic today, the green energy future, this is something when I started studying this, coming out of the oil industry in the early 80s, going to university, studying environmental engineering, I became interested in that. The papers I was reading and citing at that time, they all came out of the University of California at Davis about the regulation of the wind industry at that time. The US was a leading nation in wind energy in the late 70s and early 80s. We have photovoltaics today because of NASA. Subsequently, the industry, the photovoltaics moved into Japan, then it moved into Germany, now it is in China. So it moves to where the markets are, where the production costs are lowest. It's a global industry that will move around the world in a way. And the same in a way also happened with the wind industry. So rather than talking about just one nation exporting and developing policies to do that, which is a sort of 19th century mercantilistic approach, I see the renewable energy industry as a global industry from the beginning and has strong roots also in the United States. And in a way, it's a dialogue about what went wrong, why did it not continue in the US, why did it then develop so well in Denmark, in Germany, and in other European countries. And what does that hold in terms of messages as the US wants to reconnect to that and build up the industry itself. So, that is already 4 minutes wasted, isn't it?
Keep on rolling.
Great. Let me do very quickly 3 things. I think one is tell you a little bit about why Germany and how the decision to phase out nuclear power came about. And if you want to develop that, ask me questions afterwards. Then I'll tell you a little bit about what the future might look like, what is the vision, the positive view of what Germany has of itself in terms of energy systems. And again, we can expand on that, and the last one will be just a few highlights on what I foresee that means for Germany's role in Europe and in the world, and possibly transatlantic cooperation or global cooperation in that field. So nuclear power. In order to understand what happened in Germany, you have to go back a little bit to the 1950s or even earlier. You know, nuclear technology was something that started with Otto Hahn, with Lise Meitner, with Fritz Strassmann. The intellectual input of Albert Einstein, they all played a role. So the intellectual basis is in part German. And you know that the technology was developed in the US during the Second World War with a military intention. And we know the outcome of that and the consequences for Japan. In the 1950s, there was a drive to if you like, make good the harm that nuclear technology had done by developing atoms for peace. It was called in the United States. We called it the Euratom Treaty, the European Treaty for the Expansion of Nuclear Energy. In the 1950s, the belief that nuclear power would be safe, would be clean, would be too cheap to meter, that's a term that came at that point. Germany was caught up in that craze, like most industrial nations at that time. However, Germany was not allowed to develop technology base so that it would be able to develop nuclear arms. The deal in Europe was always Germany was allowed the civilian use of nuclear technology, but was not allowed the reprocessing and the other components in the closing of the fuel cycle that would allow it to develop nuclear arms. Germany, like Japan, and to a certain extent Canada, are technologically advanced countries that have a civilian nuclear technology, that are actually technology providers to other countries. They all have export segments in their nuclear industry, and they don't have a link to nuclear weapons, nuclear arms. That, I think, explains to this day why Germany can more easily forego a future that has nuclear power than any of the nuclear powers, the US, France, the United Kingdom, Russia, and China could. It's important to understand that point. The second one is in the 1970s, after the student revolts of 1968, which had an anti-capitalist, anti-establishment feel in Europe and more of an anti-Vietnam feel in the United States. So there were differences in the tonality, if you like, of the conflict, but essentially in the tailwind of that development, a local opposition to the construction of a nuclear power plant in Wiel in Baden-Württemberg in southwest Germany resulted in that project being abandoned. It hasn't been built, and out of that came a number of consequences. You can draw a line to the establishment of the Green Party in Germany coming out of that movement. Definitely the Ecologic Institute, one of the leading think tanks thinking about the risks of nuclear power, the impact on human health of radioactive or nuclear radiation, and now a think tank that is thinking about the energy future. It's really the think tank that has sketched Germany's future, came out of that movement established in 1977. This is important because, in contrast to all other countries I know, possibly with the exception of the US, what happened is that we had extra university, outside of the establishment, critical research that was established in an institutional home with the Ecologic Institute. So this was a constant point of reference for everybody in the community that wanted to think about nuclear power and the alternatives. As a consequence in the 1970s of the oil crises, 1973, 74, and then again different dynamics, 79 to 81, Germany and the US invested in the development of renewable technologies. Millions of Deutschmarks and dollars went into that. Basically, German establishment across party lines in the 1970s said, if we need to reduce our dependence on oil, that was the consequence, then we need to build nuclear power plants, but we also want to develop the option of alternative energies, it was called at that time, and they were not called renewable at that time. After Chernobyl, across party lines, there was a broad majority in German public opinion and elite opinion that we didn't want nuclear power anymore. That didn't mean that we knew what to do instead, but at least it was clear that this is something we didn't want. And it took 5 years approximately after Chernobyl before Germany worked out what it wanted. And that led to the adoption of the Stromeinspeisegesetz, the original electricity feed-in law, feed-in tariff it's now known, comes from 1990. And I simply ask you, imagine what would have happened if Republicans with a capital R, who own land, who own forests, who own businesses in the Mountain West, had managed through their lobbying friends in K Street in Washington to obtain a federal law that forces power utilities to buy the electricity from their hydropower plants. Imagine what would have happened in the US today, because that is what the Stromeinspeisegesetz of 1990 does. It was invented by conservative people in Bavaria who were frustrated with the low pay that they got for the power they fed back into the grid. They wanted to have a fair price. They wanted to have. They understood that there needs to be a margin for distribution, but they wanted that to be fair. And that is the origin. So the support, the initial support for the expansion of renewable energy came from the conservative part of the political spectrum in alliance with the Greens. The Conservatives knew what they wanted, a fair price, and the Greens had thought through how it could be achieved, feed-in tariff. And the marriage of these two ideas in 1990 laid the groundwork. Sorry, I'm at the tail end of a cold, and I'm catching my throat at the moment.
Do you want some water beyond this?
I think I'm fine with Coke, it should be.
Would you like a vitamin C?
That doesn't help at this point. I should have taken that 2 weeks ago. But throughout the 1990s, on the basis of this feed-in law, Germany developed the wind industry, it developed the beginning of the solar industry, it began to think about the bioenergy industry. By the year 2000, the industry was mature enough and the understanding of the dynamics of change was good enough, so that in 2000 the government and the utilities, all the 4 operators of nuclear power plants in Germany, negotiated a nuclear phase-out that would have taken the last nuclear power plant to be switched off in 2023 is the estimate. There was no fixed endpoint because they defined the residual amount of power that could be produced in the fleet of existing nuclear power plants. And then we had the whole of the noughties from 2000 to 2009, 2010, when that development continued. And it's really the aberration in that long-term continuity with cross-party consensus, with the majority of the members of all the political parties in Germany wanting out of nuclear power. The aberration from that long-term policy vector came with the election of the current administration in Germany that then decided to extend the running time of the existing fleet of nuclear power plants. They didn't dare to propose build new ones, politically not feasible in Germany, they knew that, but they felt that they should allow the operators to run the nuclear power plants for longer, milk the revenue, part of that, through taxation, in order to put that money into the expansion of the renewable sector. At least that was the rhetoric. What in actual fact they intended, and whether they had intended to later on also invest in the construction of new power plants, new nuclear power plants, nobody knows, because then Fukushima happened. But even before Fukushima, what you realized is that the conflict, the grand societal conflict, gesellschaftlicher Großkonflikt, it's a term because it describes what happened in Germany over nuclear power. It is a conflict between generations, across generations. What you saw happening as a consequence of the extension of the running time is that grandparents went on demonstrations against nuclear power with their grandchildren. Deep into the conservative part of the German population, people went and demonstrated against nuclear power. It was perfectly clear that this would be the end of any chance of conservative-led government in Germany for a decade. And so there was also an electoral dynamic that meant that the ruling parties in Germany had to correct that mistake, because otherwise they would have become de facto unelectable in Germany over the next decade, and that is something they didn't want to do. So when you read in the press that the Germans are irrational when they phase out nuclear power, that it was all politics and electioneering and that Germany panicked, I hope that this rendition of the historic ramp up to this decision explains to you that this was politically perfectly rational, and that behind that there is the build-up of a renewable energy industry that is now so mature that you can actually predict how it will develop in the future. You can develop scenarios that say 100% renewable energy, 100% renewable electricity, or 100% renewable energy by 2030. The government doesn't buy into those ambitious scenarios. It buys into scenarios that say 80% renewable power by 2050. That is because in the power industry and in the Ministry of Economics in Berlin, there's a number of people who simply cannot imagine that you can run a power system without having big nuclear or coal-fired power plants, running the baseload of the system, setting the rhythm, and then you add on all the distributed little bits. Whether they're users or whether they're producers doesn't matter. Somebody has to provide the backbone for the system. These are people who come from an old engineering tradition, old economic tradition, regulatory tradition. The people who are younger, the people who have grown up with the internet, who understand about the self-stabilization, self-management of markets as well as electronic systems, they know that you can just as well run a power system with distributed generation and distributed consumption of power, as long as you have signal processing, as long as you have somebody giving the rhythm, the 50 or 60 hertz cycle that needs to be maintained, that you understand where the frequency goes, you understand where the voltage, the tension in the system goes, and you need to convert that into price signals so that people can react autonomously by expanding their supply or reducing their consumption or vice versa, depending on what the grid needs. Building self-stabilizing systems is actually relatively easy, and the signal processing needs that you have in a smart grid are just a small fraction of the signal processing that we have in the internet anyway. It's not impossible to do. Just some people can imagine it and some people can't. It's a generational conflict, but it's also a cultural conflict between people with different backgrounds and possibly also different interests. And with that, I already sketched a little bit the future. Distributed generation with a smart grid, with storage in the system. I'll come back to the storage part because it's important. With load-based tariffs that give incentives to use your electricity when it is cheap, to adjust your consumption, switch off that deep freeze for 4 hours at a time when power is expensive, and switch it back on again. You have conservative parts in the system that can equally shift in time the power consumption. This is something that is very new. No industrial country has used that flexibility that we have on the demand side so far. Germany is now experimenting with that. The US is experimenting as well, but the lessons are very difficult to tease out and very difficult to generalize. So it will take 10, 15 years to bring that into the mainstream and have enough experience on how to manage these systems in that way. Storage. The more storage you have in the system somewhere, the more you can cope with the variations of supply and demand. The German government has decided that they want to have 1 million electric vehicles on the road. That would be equivalent to 4 million in the US. The total capacity of the batteries in those electric vehicles will provide storage space. I haven't done the calculations, but somebody told me that it is between 8 and 12 days of power supply for the economy as a whole that you can hold in car batteries. Now, the sooner we can move towards electric mobility and the better we can integrate the storage capacity in those car batteries into the grid, by having them connected to the grid for as long as possible during the day, by having bi-directional capacity so that everybody is a consumer but also a producer. Everybody can store up charge up their batteries and they can release power, stabilizing the grid. The more easy it will be to deal with the variations of the supply of renewable energy. Let me just open a bracket and talk about intermittency. You know, renewable energy is intermittent. Mistake. It is somebody who is playing with your minds. Intermittency is the sudden disappearance of a power supply source. Nuclear power is intermittent because a nuclear power plant can go off with 1 second warning. That's all you get. If you have distributed renewable generation, it doesn't matter if one wind power plant gets hit by lightning and then is destroyed for some reason. Actually, they get hit by lightning, they're hardened, they can take that. But let's assume that one blows up, and you can find that on YouTube somewhere, a wind power plant going haywire. It doesn't matter to the system. It's a stochastic event when something small adds to the system or is taken away from the system. It doesn't matter, it is self-stabilizing. It's completely different with nuclear power. Because of the short warning time and the large size of the contribution of each nuclear power plant, the people who do the power trading, they must have insurance. They must buy contingent power from other suppliers in order to be prepared for that point in time when the nuclear power plant stops operating with 1 second warning. That is why you have 5 to 8% of the generating capacity is so-called spinning reserve. It sits there, it spins, ready to produce electricity at that 1 second notice. Between 5 and 8% of the carbon dioxide emissions of a typical industrialized country are caused only by the spinning reserve. You wouldn't need that if you had enough storage capacity connected to the grid. And that is where you see that the co-transformation of the power system and the mobility system is actually beneficial. Combining them and transforming them both at the same time is actually cheaper and more easy to imagine than moving towards electric mobility conceptually on its own, or transforming the power grid on its own. So I think that described a little bit the vision of that. We can go into the individual technologies if you like. What does that mean for Germany and Europe? Germany has developed a number of technologies that become now export. Some of the patents are owned by German companies. Actually, nobody holds patents in German companies. They're either American companies or Swiss companies or somewhere else where you don't pay taxes so much. But essentially, it is an international intellectual property base that is underpinning those industries. The most innovative part is now in bioenergy. The most valuable patents are probably at the moment in the wind industry, possibly also in solar industry. It's difficult to say without really looking at the prospects of the market segments and which technology vector might actually be dominant. You see the rate of innovation and the cost regression in all those sectors. So any technology that looks promising today may actually be a loser in 3 years' time. That's why you get bankruptcies at the same time as the industry grows. It's the technological experimentation of the various avenues that are open to engineers. So my prediction is that Germany and the companies involved, they're global companies involved in this transition, on the basis of the experience that they gain in Germany, will help the rest of the world make similar transitions. Japan is phasing out nuclear power from about 29% before Fukushima to 0. If all goes well, they'll switch off their last nuclear reactor, the last of 454, on the 8th of April. That's the fastest phase out that you can possibly imagine. So Germany will not be the first country to phase out. It will be the second country to phase out unless other countries overtake us before 2022, when the last power plant will be switched off in Germany under the current legislation. As a consequence of that, the world has learned to reassess the economics of nuclear power and the risks of nuclear power. The economics of nuclear power were always bad. To this day, the industry needs to be shielded from liability. It needs heavy subsidies wherever they are, whether it is $8 billion in loan guarantees to build a new reactor in Georgia, or whether it is for the training, the university training of the engineers in that sector, whether it is for the fuel cycle management, whether it is for the waste management side of it. Everywhere around, costs are absorbed by taxpayers, even though they should be borne by the ratepayers that consume the nuclear power. At the same time, if you look around the world, our conflict with Iran, our conflict with North Korea, our fears about Pakistan, they all have something to do with the fact that we have been careless in exporting nuclear technology, thinking that there's this difference between civilian nuclear technology and military nuclear technology. There isn't. So there is a huge security policy price that we will pay, all of us will pay, and many generations ahead of us will pay in those volatile regions. And I think if the whole cost of what is happening around the world, any war that is induced by or is triggered by conflict over nuclear technology, had to be borne by the nuclear industry, and nuclear power would be unaffordable. If you just require nuclear power plants to get liability insurance for the damage that they cause when they explode, they wouldn't run today. Fukushima costs $250 billion today, still counting. Chernobyl, $700 billion, still counting, because the core melt is not actually finished.
That's the point, yeah.
3 Mile Island is cheaper, but the accident isn't finished, and it was really lucky. Essentially, when a nuclear power plant blows up, it bankrupts the utility, it bankrupts the insurer, it can bankrupt a country that's too small to absorb it.
Right.
So smaller countries simply cannot insure their own nuclear industry because there aren't enough assets after the explosion that you can sell. So it's economically, and this has been revealed. So in a way, we now know that the emperor has no clothes, and that will, over time, arrive in the heads of the people who are still protagonists of nuclear power around the world. And my prediction is that it will first lead to Europe calling into question the sense of the Euratom Treaty. There is actually demand from the Green Party in Germany for Germany to either reform the Euratom Treaty, or if that is impossible, to unilaterally withdraw from it. So Germany would exit from an important pillar of the European Union's cooperation. Second, as a consequence of that, we have to rethink the proliferation of nuclear technology, civilian nuclear technology, to other countries. That's the role of the International Atomic Energy Agency that does it. It basically lost its rationale. Its raison d'etre is no longer there, because we know that civilian nuclear power doesn't make economic sense. So there is no reason for it, and you can assume that every country that invests in nuclear power does it either because there are corrupt practices and kickbacks organized, or because they actually have a military intention. There is no rationale otherwise to do it. And then there's a question what we do with the non-proliferation treaty, which in its third pillar also has language about supporting the civilian use of nuclear power. It creates rights of access to this technology, which again is not legitimate anymore, and it should be reformed. And that is something that the US and Europe might do together. So with that, nuclear phase out, the ramping up of renewable energy, and what it might mean for international or global nuclear governance, I've opened 3 chapters, if you like, for our discussion, and I look forward to it. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Andreas. That was a tour de force, and there are so many topics here that it's going to be hard to find the roten faden, but I'm going to give it a...
I don't believe in the red threads. I believe in webs of ideas.
That's right, and circles, and yeah, that's right. Part of my role here is, of course, to facilitate the conversation, but part of it is also to be a bit of a provocateur and tickle you a little bit on some fronts. Even though I share your views, and that makes it hard for me to do, I'll try to oblige. I think one of the most important points that very few people will be able to argue with you here is that I think nowhere around the world, maybe with very few exceptions, have we done a very good job at pricing externalities into the cost of energy, and I think that is about the biggest structural problem that we're facing, to put renewables on an equal footing. And so, but leaving that aside, and also trying to leave aside for just a moment, issues of political quote-unquote religion, of not wanting to change, corruption and things of age and mindset. There are pragmatists who are very well in favor of a switch to renewables and to a clean energy future, who say that it's actually not so much about building systems technologically. It's reasonably easy to do. I think you said it yourself. It's not that hard to do to build a self-adapting and self-healing system, in theory or in practice. Certainly not in a lab. But with a little bit of background and having done a large project for the U.S. government, looking at smart grids and what's happening around the world, there are some, I think, valid voices out there that say, the unfortunate problem with building a self-healing smart grid is that it's not the technology that is vulnerable. It's the layering of different systems that are actually, some of which are actually not technological in nature. And by that I mean, as soon as you throw humans in the mix, errors start happening. And as soon as you throw markets in the mix, as we've seen plenty, errors start to happen. And in many sectors of the economy, that goes over without a whole lot of damage. But in energy, where frankly you're not just dealing with bits and bytes, you're dealing with electrons that behave very differently. That has proven very difficult. And then you layer on top of that regulatory systems and the politics associated with that, and it becomes a mess. At least in the United States, we've proven that with the Northeast power outage and some other instances. So it's a systems of systems type issue, and while many people who are familiar with those issues will agree with the long-term vision, they will also say that it's really a complexity issue and it's a timing issue, not as much of a capability issue. And I'm wondering if you could say a little bit about that and talk about sort of the timing aspect of it. To be very concrete, Germany has the mission, has the goal of 30% by 2020, 80% by 2050, I think is the goal.
That's the official goal, and I put that question mark behind that because I think
Okay.
it's too slow.
It's too slow, okay. It's a perfect setup for a little bit of a controversial conversation because you know, having worked in complex systems, frankly, even without the government or civil society being part of it, they always take longer, they're always tremendously more expensive. And we're witnessing this right now with the high-speed rail system here in California as well. Say a little bit about the timing of it, the complexity of it. You know, are you in fact taking account of some of those system-of-system challenges? Is a faster timeline realistic in light of that? And then maybe I'll follow on with one or two other questions before opening it up.
Could I ask a real simple,
Yeah.
straightforward question? Do you believe it's possible to run Germany 100% on solar and renewables? Because I believe it's possible to run California 100% on solar and renewables.
It's not a question of belief. I can actually point you to a website of a research project that has proven that it can be done.
It can be done.
Proof of concept and scenario for scaling up.
Good. That's what I want to hear.
It always amuses me when Americans ask me whether I believe in something, as if these things were a matter of religion. No, they're not. It's a question of knowing and not knowing, and knowing how firm your knowledge is, what the margins of error or of uncertainty are. And that is indeed the question.
Right, same thing
I
as
fully understand that point, and the debate in Germany is now about how fast can we layer those systems and learn quickly enough to avoid systemic mistakes. I don't think anybody wants to avoid mistakes. On the contrary, the system should be tolerant to mistakes being made. Markets are tolerant systems in that sense. They're much more tolerant to mistakes being made than nuclear power plants, which are highly deterministic in everything, and nothing should happen that is outside of very narrow parameters. My belief is that the system can be transformed much faster than the government, basically because I make that connection between the transformation of the energy system and the transformation of the mobility system, and I connect the two. And all you need is bidirectional capacity in the car batteries. In Germany and around the world, most people who think about electric mobility think that you charge your battery and then you drive. And when it's empty, you recharge it. And I say, no, your battery can actually be used to stabilize the grid. It can provide a grid stabilization service. My economic argument is that if it's true that we can save 5 to 8% of the cost, depends on the country, for the spinning reserve, if we can take that cost out of the utility bill and use that to reward people who provide grid stabilization services, that basically does the same function as the spinning reserve, then this inflow of money into the battery business, if you like, into electric mobility business, is enough to accelerate that. I'm always in favor of a system that is nested. And in actual fact, if you look at power systems, you have distribution grids in almost every municipality. Large towns actually will have many distribution systems, grids, in their various parts. And they are then connected at a higher level with a grid that has a higher voltage, has a little bit more power, and in between you have transformers. They should all have bidirectional capacity. And in Germany, that's the bottleneck we have at the moment. That many of those transformer stations, they're designed only to ship electricity down into the distribution net. And if you have too much solar power panels sitting in one distribution grid, and if the sun's shining, then the electricity system in some parts of southern Germany is overheating. They have too much power in it. At the moment, they can't feed that back into the larger scale grid in order to ship it into the neighboring regions where there may not be so many solar panels. So it's the bidirectional capacity you need to build, and actually it doesn't matter for society as a whole if a distribution grid in one part of town browns out occasionally. It has happened in the past. Germans are no longer used to that. If the lights go out, it's a crisis. When I was a child, it happened every year 3 or 4 times.
San Francisco 2 times a year.
Yeah.
The blackout here too.
Yeah, that's right.
Occasionally it happens. It doesn't kill the country as a whole.
Yeah.
You have backup power systems at all your critical infrastructure, all your hospitals, all your fire stations, whatever.
Yeah.
They have
General thing.
systems. We should have more of those to make the system more self-healing. But that is why I say it can happen faster. But exactly the government says there is a limit. You need to have 20% of large power plants coal-fired because you can't have nuclear power anymore, and that you need 20% minimum in order to stabilize the whole system.
Mhm.
And I believe that you don't have to do that, but I don't think at this point it's necessary to prove that conclusively, because you cannot prove anything conclusively as long as it's only a scenario. The blueprint is never conclusive proof. We simply have to go there and use that time to learn as we move from 2012 to 2050 and see how fast we can go, and we will learn about the interplay between the different systems and how to make each of the systems more resilient as we develop that.
Excellent. Great answer, thank you. Before we open it up, let me just do justice to the fact that this is supposed to be a fireside chat and tee up two more topics that the audience might pick up on in one way or another. The first one is, as we now switch off nuclear power plants, and this came out in our study tour in November as well, Germany will substitute some of that lost energy supply with, or at least that's what was said, with Russian gas and with imported coal. You know, just as we witnessed this week, I don't know whether you were already en route or whether you saw this in the news, there has been another bottleneck with regard to Russian gas, and the Russians are blaming the Ukrainians once again. And so Germany is struggling a little bit with that bottleneck and with that lopsided political dependency there. And then secondly, that coal is certainly not healthy either in terms of carbon emissions. Maybe you could say something about the substitution path in the short run and what our trade-offs are. And then if you could say a few words about China, because if in fact Germany is now withdrawing from nuclear, and German companies will no longer engage in Germany, what does that mean for where the capabilities are migrating? How do you see China evolving as a nuclear power, both from an economic standpoint and from a security standpoint?
Do you want to invite me again at some point? Very quickly, sort of the substitution paths. You focused on the bottleneck, which is because of the way the gas flows through Europe, we do have the prospect of a shortage in southern Germany on condition that the cold spell continues for some time. The gas distribution system in Germany and in any country is a huge storage facility. The pipelines, they can hold so much gas. It's enormous. Every winter we have difficulties. Sometimes they're political, sometimes they're technical, sometimes the Russians' equipment simply fails. Every winter there's a little bit of a problem. The real story last week was that during that cold spell, France, as a winter peaking country, could no longer supply its own population with power. So the Germans are now at this critical moment. Europe is peaking because of the cold spell. Germany is supplying France with power. This is
3 gigawatts, was it?
something like it.
Yeah,
Sounds
3
it sounds
gigawatts.
plausible.
Yeah.
Looking at the capacity of the interconnections, I think that would also be the limit of what we can do.
Right.
It's not the capacity of Germans to produce more. I think we still have a 7 percentage point margin between the current load and the total capacity of the power plant fleet in Germany.
It was just reported in Der Spiegel.
Yeah, I believe it. I haven't read the Spiegel, but that is in essence what is going on there. What happened is before the nuclear phase-out, the phase-out as it was, let's start with the nuclear phase-out as it is. And at the same time, the decision to phase out hard coal and in 2050 or 2060 also lignite, depending on who you believe and whether you want to phase it out more quickly. The question is, where does the power come from in between? The assumption is Russian gas, you pointed that out. With the forecast demand, with the nuclear phase-out and with the slow ramp-up of renewable energy, the assumption was that Germany would consume so much gas from Russia that it would be worthwhile the Russians developing the Stockman field. with the nuclear phase-out put on hold, with the current administration then extending the running time, suddenly that demand for additional gas over a period of 10 to 20, 25 years disappeared, because suddenly nuclear had a higher share. That basically destroyed the business case for Stockman. And now we have shale gas coming in and lowering the price of gas around the world, and giving some European countries the dream that they can become gas exporters. Poland does that. Germany and France and other countries have decided against the development of shale gas. Essentially, what happens is that the faster you ramp up renewables, the faster you can also save on the emissions of gas. The more gas you have in the system, because gas-fired power plants, they're very responsive, they can go up and down very quickly, the easier it is to deal with the variations, and I said predictable variations of renewable energy. So the combination of gas and wind actually works quite well, even in the absence of storage. If you want to work without gas, then you need more storage. So that's the transition path. What does it mean for China? I began the talk by saying Germany is a purely civilian nuclear technology provider. China, like the other veto powers in the Security Council, is a military-first provider or holder of nuclear technology. My prediction is that the Chinese will be the second last nation to phase out nuclear power. The Russians will be last, basically because the Russians don't have economic rationality in their decision-making. The Chinese do. The Chinese, about the planning system you can say bad things, but every economic decision in the planning structure in China is educated by economic analysis, and the weight of economists is growing. And the Chinese are not ideologically wedded to nuclear power in the same way as the French are, for example. What you have is a very strong power structure within China, within the military, within the Communist Party, and in the regions where the nuclear industry is very strong, just as you have that in other countries as well. And they can protect their interests for a while, but they also can't escape economic reality. The discussion with China is always, Germany is phasing out, could China do the same? They can probably phase out, but the dynamics would be very different, because Germany is a mature country, it's a re-industrializing country, our industrial base is growing. China is growing for the first time. The German power system has ample overcapacity in every component, whether it's generating capacity, whether it is transmission capacity, distribution capacity. Yes, with little bottlenecks that they're emerging, but the system as a whole has huge overcapacity. And to make a transformation is easy when you're fat. It's more difficult when you're lean and hungry and growing fast like China, which means that the phase-out path in China must be completely different. However, having said that, if you look at the contribution that China now makes to cost reductions in the solar industry, if you can imagine that the same thing would happen to the wind industry. If you look at the experience that China has in electric mobility, if you go to China, chances are that you are run over by an electric scooter coming from the wrong side. It's amazing. They have the operational experience in society already, much more than Tesla has, simply because there are so many more on the road. So I guess that China has the capacity, they have the policy management system. It is a well-run centralist country. We may object to the treatment of human rights and to other aspects of it, but it is better run. They can build roads, airports, whole cities much faster than anybody else in the world can. So they have capacities that are enormous, and they can do it if they like.
Great. At this point, I'll open it up. Any questions from the audience, talking or not talking to what was discussed so far?
I think we should have a cheer for Hermann Scheer. Everybody knows Hermann Scheer, right?
He's the father of feed-in tariff, right?
Yes. He's the reason we're all here, actually, because he made investing in green possible.
He was a politician, he died too young, suddenly, who made it his life's mission to argue for renewable energy, predominantly solar. His dream was really solar, but he was supportive also of other renewable energies. And he really was the voice to government and within parliament. I had the pleasure of moderating him on several occasions, and that was always a very difficult job, because the man had a mission, and he had an exuberant mind, and he wouldn't be stopped. Yeah, we miss him.
Any other questions? Gentleman over on the right, and then the gentleman over here to my left.
You mentioned the existence of a blueprint that would lead to 100% renewable generation.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have a resource where one can find
Yeah.
the landscape of technologies that would be required to make that a reality?
The short answer is go to Kombi-Kraftwerk. Kombi with a K, Kombi as in combination, and Kraftwerk as the music band of the .de. Essentially what they did is they took the load curve of the German power supply in the system. And then they took a number of wind power plants, a number of solar power plants, some pump storage, and some plants that convert biomass into electricity. And they put that together in a virtual power plant, connected through the power grid, but also through the internet in Germany. And they took a fixed percentage of the total German load curve, and they followed that by managing their resources, their power plants, their storage capacity. Some of that variable, not dispatchable, such as the wind power. Some of that variable but controllable, like hydropower. Some of that fully dispatchable, that is the bioenergy fired power plants. And they proved that they could follow the ups and downs of the load curve. And they've been doing that for some years now, and they can show that they can do it. And then they said, well, can we scale up to the whole of the German load curve? How long would it take? That means you need to look at, can you scale up each component? Are there limits? How quickly can it be done? What are the resource implications of that? How much land do you have to produce the biomass and things like that? And they basically showed through scenario building that they can build up this concept to 100% renewable supply by 2050. They've done that without demand response and without storage. If conceptually you integrate demand response and storage from electric vehicles into that concept, then I say you can be at 100% renewable power by 2035. And let's see. I like to be wrong, and the truth to be turn out that we can do it in 2037. I don't care, as long as we have a dialogue about how fast it can happen and what tells us whether we can accelerate or whether we have to slow down.
And if you allow a short follow-up.
Sure, if I could ask you though, could you all introduce yourselves when you speak, just so we know?
Sure. So my name is George Vanadopoulos, and I have a technical consulting business right across the bay. The follow-up question is, is there a list of specific bottlenecks or major impediments to that vision? What do you think are the next steps, both on a technical level, which is more of my interest, and also on a legislative or regulatory level, in order to make that vision a reality? So if you had to dispatch resources, what would be the next thing that you would tackle?
I already said what I regard as the critical issue, and that's the bidirectional capacity and the standards that apply to the interface between the power grid and the battery storage in cars. It's a question of standards also in the signal processing. You need to have protocols for the information exchange between the car, its battery, and the grid, and somebody who manages the contract, pays the reward, calculates the price or the reward that you get. This is something where I feel there will be a battle between lobbyists of different interests happening. Germany, moving ahead as it does in this, has already encountered one problem, and that is that the German feed-in legislation gives priority grid access to renewable energy, which is good if your percentage of renewable energy is small and if you can always displace some non-renewable. But as soon as you have 100% renewable on the grid, then you can't have priority or even guaranteed grid access anymore. You need mechanisms for choosing between different types of renewable energy in order to manage the grid as a whole. The German legislation doesn't currently provide for that. With the latest legal reform that entered into force at the beginning of this year, They're experimenting a little bit with load shedding or no supply shedding of renewable energies under certain circumstances. I don't think that's perfect. We'll still have to learn and refine the law as we go further. In the end, when you have a 100% renewable system, then you cannot give guaranteed access to the grid or even priority access to the grid anymore. That figure in the law has to disappear at some point over the next 2 or 3 decades. Don't know exactly where, but conceptually we have to think about living without that guaranteed access. In May of last year, that was after Fukushima, after 8 nuclear power plants were suddenly switched off. There were another 5 nuclear power plants in Germany that were shut in May for scheduled maintenance. There was a question whether industry would do that or whether they would stagger the maintenance. They chose not to. So Germany ran for a few days on only 4 nuclear power plants in May. It was sunny, it was windy at that time. So in a way it was a stress test for the power supply system. And what you do under those circumstances, you do thermal monitoring of your critical infrastructure. You look at, because a power system doesn't collapse within a millisecond. There are signs of overheating, physical overheating. You can look at your transformer and it heats up. If you look at the lines and they heat up. Through thermal monitoring, you find out where your bottlenecks are and you know where the additional incremental investment has to go to strengthen capacities, to duplicate a transformer, to string a few additional wires on existing poles in order to increase capacity. And with marginal incremental investment, you can increase the capacity of the grid by 15%, perhaps 20%, simply by identifying where the bottlenecks in the system are. Over time, yes, additional investment will have to take place somewhere, but that's the way it goes. There is a conceptual battle, and this is my last point in Germany. Some of the big utilities, they are not interested in this, buying into this vision of a distributed system, because they cannot exercise monopoly power within that anymore. They want to have concentrated production of power. They don't care whether it is nuclear or whether it is offshore wind, as long as it enters into the system in big pipes and in few points, because that is the locations at which you can, through ownership, control the system as a whole. You only need to own the critical bits of the infrastructure in order to politically and economically dominate the system as a whole. So that is why there are some people who say the critical aspect of German energy development is to build high voltage transmission lines across Europe. We need 4,500 kilometers of them. No, we don't. We need 250 kilometers well placed at various points in the grid. A study for the German Ministry of Economic Affairs has proven that. The study was published in February of last year. 250 kilometers of additional lines is all we need. And yet there is talk about 4,500, and the difference is a different vision of what the renewable energy industry should look like in the future, whether it should be concentrated production in the North African desert through concentrated solar power, offshore wind in the North Sea, and in between high voltage lines that then create monopoly control, or whether it should be distributed, self-healing system as I described. I subscribe to the decentralized version.
The gentleman over here in the corner, please, if you could introduce yourself too.
I'm Peter Northup. I'm a volunteer with Gaba. I had a question about, I was just reading this morning about continuing fallout between China and the EU about the airspace carbon trading scheme, and China not wanting its airlines to participate in this. And I know the United States has also had objections to this. So I guess with that as kind of an exemplar of political difficulties, to what extent are you worried about this sort of race to the bottom kind of competition incentives, particularly in difficult economic times, leading to barriers in the way of implementing the kinds of policies that lead to the vision you have? And then in particular, what you were saying about decentralized vision, when the difficulties of course, those who benefit from a decentralized economic vision by the nature of the decentralized system, therefore don't have the big money to lobby towards that kind of thing coming into effect, whereas those who want a monopoly control kind of system tend to be able to push for that. What do you see as ways to kind of work around these sort of political incentive difficulties?
One thing is that reform is always difficult because the power of the incumbent is always greater than the power of the new idea, the new entrance. You can read that in Machiavelli's Prince somewhere. And it's true, and that is in part of the problem that we are facing here. It's the incumbent are the utilities that have nuclear power plants that control the grid. In Germany, we're still vertically integrated, so the people who own and operate the grid historically, they also own the generating capacity. We are still in the process of unbundling. We've made some progress, so at least in operational terms, they're now separated, but there's still ownership control, but that will probably, because the European policy wants an unbundling, because the grid is in public service, generation is not. And it's an important conceptual distinction that needs to be accepted in the minds, and it needs to be reflected in the law and in the regulatory practice. And we're moving in that direction. The German experience worked, and that is why I focused a little bit on the timeline and used that as a ramp-up for our discussion here today, because in the beginning, it was only, in the 1970s, it was only research laboratories and engineering and development agencies that were interested in renewable energies, and some tinkerers. There were always some people in Germany. You have so many engineers that like to play around, and you have tinkerers with wind power, you had them. But essentially what you build up is a small base that at the beginning doesn't look threatening to the established utilities. And they tolerated that, they even supported that, they bought into that, because to them it is a development option that can ensure their own survival. Everybody has to have a portfolio of options going forward if you want to survive a change in the system. The conceptual ideas matured in the 1980s. But essentially, when today you go and you say, we don't believe in renewable energy because we don't want to threaten the jobs in the nuclear industry. E.ON has 2,300 people working in its nuclear division. It has, I don't know, 20,000 people working overall, so it's a small percentage. There are actually more people working in the renewable energy industry today than in the nuclear industry or in the coal industry. The wind power industry in Germany is the second largest consumer of steel. So the labor union of the steel industry is now in favor of wind. Of course they are. So over time you accumulate friends as the transition goes along. And that is why I think that the incremental learning and the putting in of solutions and building up the businesses and learning the technologies and building up the training facilities, all the while you do that, you build friends, you gather forces, and at the same time you make your solution more acceptable because people understand it. Normal people are afraid of the unknown, and if you go there and you tell them about fantastic new development and it's going to, they can't buy into that. They can buy into it if they see that it works at small scale, that it works in some cases, and they can transfer, and they can say, well, if it works in Japan, perhaps it works here as well. You build the credibility with this incremental part. The US can do the same. The US has all the components in its place. In actual fact, when it comes to smart grid technologies, the US is leading. If you want to read a business case story, look at RuggedCom. They make hubs. You know, hubs, when you have a computer system in your office, somewhere you have a switch and a hub and important pieces to manage the signal processing. They're great, but they're vulnerable. If you put them right next to your power outlet, then you get signal disturbance. If you put them next to a transformer station, they will simply cease working because of the electromagnetic fields. For a smart grid, you need hubs that can operate right next to a transformer station in outdoors environment where it is hot in the summer and cold in the winter, and where lightning strikes and rain falls, sand blows, whatever. I mean, you need hardened electronics. Who makes that? The typical IT hardware provider doesn't do that, but there are companies that now produce it. They're American.
Just one note, Scheer's book, Herman Scheer's book, answered that debate very well. I mean, I don't know if people read Herman Scheer's new book, Energy Imperative. You got to read it. It's his 40-year struggle of how he got to where he did, and every debate, every struggle he went through is in this small book. And it shows beautifully how he got past every barrier.
I support that motion. It is a great book. Anybody else? Yes, the gentleman here to my left.
Yeah, I have a question. My name is Joachim Seel. I'm a renewable energy market researcher and policy researcher at UC Berkeley and the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory over there. Are you aware of any economic studies which have looked at this vehicle-to-grid option which you proposed, and the vehicle-to-grid, where you use electric vehicles and then use it as a storage backup option? I agree that it has tremendous appeal, but at the moment, if we look at the electric vehicle market, it is still a very small market, and the most costly component of that is the battery. And if you try to buy a Nissan Leaf or a Chevy Volt, it's $40,000, much more expensive than any of the other cars in that market segment. And the battery is expected to have a life of maybe 8 years, 10 years, and is likely to be replaced. If you use the battery in order to charge the grid again, you run down the recharging cycles, and there's a finite amount of charging cycles, so you need a cost incentives. Are you aware of any cost studies which look at the increment between base price and peak price?
Yeah, I vaguely remember. If you go to my Facebook site, you find me on Facebook, and if you go back in the timeline, well, actually, I'm not on timeline yet, but so you have to go to older posts. At some point, I believe, I did write a little note about a study which I vaguely remember. It was the American East Coast, I think it was Pennsylvania as a model, because you have to look at the concrete regulatory settings in one jurisdiction. You can't do that without that context knowledge. And I remember that story coming out, that analysis coming out with that a typical car could earn between $5 and $8 a day if they're connected to the grid, providing grid stabilization services. Now that doesn't mean that you can actually multiply that by 365 and have an annual return, because you're not connected to the grid all the time. And your battery, if you use the car for driving as well, will sometimes be empty, at which point you can only provide one type of grid stabilization service, but not another one. Which is why I go and make the more conceptual argument and say the 5 to 8% of cost that we have associated with running the spinning reserve this is a service to the grid as a whole that could be supplied by electricity, by car batteries as well, which is another way of explaining the same story. So I hope you'll find it there, otherwise I'm afraid I will have to Google myself to find that story again.
Seems to be as much of a technical problem as it is a business case or a business model problem, right? How do you incentivize people to actually run down their cycle life on their battery in order to provide that service? What's the business model here, and who owns that battery?
If you think about it, you can say, I don't buy a battery, I don't buy storage, but I buy cycles.
Yeah.
And then you can make a case, what has each cycle cost? Divide the cost of the battery by the number of cycles, and then you work out whether it makes sense for you, whether you drive the car and empty it, or whether you make a trade. You arbitrage between different times of the day. At night, doesn't really, you can calculate the benefit. The limited number of cycles, a battery eventually will go completely flat. It happens more quickly with lead acid batteries than it does with computer batteries, but eventually they're dead. But they're not going from 100% to zero overnight. There is a sort of an exhaustion curve, and they stay at 85 to 75% for quite some time. So at some point you may retire a battery which no longer gives you the range in the car, but you may still put it into your garage in order to store up the electricity from your solar panels on the roof during the day, so that you can watch plasma television screen at night. So if that's what you want to do, that's what your car battery is still probably good for that, and you still get 3 years of life out of them that way. So my sense is that we need to learn how battery technology evolves, whether we can overcome this problem of the erosion of the storage capacity as a result of the number of cycles, whether we can improve the speed of recharging batteries. The dream is to have a recharge, 80% recharge in 3 minutes. That's what you would want to have. 3 minutes being the time you spent at the gas pump when you stopped with the car. You want to have something equivalent. And then trust technological innovation. The fascinating thing about electric mobility is when you talk to people from the car industry, they have product cycles of a decade. When you talk to people from the computer industry, they have product cycles of moving towards 12 months or even lower. They're completely different innovation speeds that they have in their mind, and batteries are more like the innovation speed in computers than they are with the innovation speed in cars. So my sense is that we will see lots of technological innovations in that field, and we will see great potential for battery makers, and we will see some of them go bust because they chose the wrong technology at the wrong time, just as we do in the solar panel industry at the moment.
Well, let me put a little pressure on this last point. I agree with you when it comes to electronic parts of battery management, but with regard to the physics and the chemistry of the batteries, that's actually proven to be quite difficult to get to the same innovation cycle, right? Because there are certain laws that we have not yet found our way around.
That may be the case, and yet I always trust that people who work with materials and work at nanoscales with new approaches, let them do their work.
Yeah.
And let's have faith in their ability, because they have the right incentives.
Point taken. Let me steer the conversation a little bit toward the United States. I would love to get your view as, I won't call you an outsider because you're quite familiar with the United States scenarios here, but still somebody who's based in Europe. Give us your point of view on what's happening in the US. Is there a path toward transformation? And let me just add in that I take your point that there's a lot of innovation happening in the United States, irrespective of the examples that you mentioned. I serve on the Eco-Imagination panel, and I see a lot of innovation happening. And there are various large players, GE, IBM, Cisco, and others who are forging into green. But many of us are still disappointed that on a national level, and frankly, mostly with respect to Washington, D.C., we have been let down when it comes to a transition to renewables or to alternative energies. Give us your point of view. How do you see the situation, and what's the evolution path for the U.S.?
I'm not quite sure where to start. One is there is a division of competences between the federal level and the state level in the US that is not conducive to finding effective solutions to this. Basically, if power use and power generation is a matter of the state, but any transmission that crosses a line is a matter for federal jurisdiction, then it's very difficult to establish something to regulate smart grids. It's actually, we made that point a few years ago when Sudine Kelly from the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission came to Germany, and as a consequence she then became the co-chair of the Smart Grid Working Group of the FERC and the Association of State-Level Utility Regulators, in order to address the conceptual issues, even though you could not overcome the jurisdictional divisions. So part of that is rethink federalism in that sense. In Europe, the pressure to unbundle is very important in order to get innovation into the industry. The pressure comes from a new political philosophy, new thinking in competition law being implemented by the European Union. So it left the jurisdiction of the member states where it had encrusted power structures, and sort of a new idea came through the European Union as we're building a common market, an internal market in Europe. So Europe in some cases can innovate policies more easily because we have a fluid up and down of competences between the member states and the new federation that the European Union is. The second one, so that was my pessimistic bit, and I'm afraid I'm here to tell you about Germany and Europe. I cannot really argue for or against any specific legislative solution, or for or against any candidate in an election here, because there is a very outdated law on the US statute book called the Foreign Agent Registration Act, which doesn't apply to me, but I still try to stay on the safe side of it. If you look at it in another way, can there be a transformation in the US? Call it transformations, because the US actually has separate power systems in different geographies. Texas is its own power system. You have one on the west coast, one on the east coast with the north, and you have weak interconnections between them. So at a technical level, you can actually make the transformation for each one of them separately. For the Texas system, it's easy. Oodles of geothermal power, oodles of wind, lots of solar power, and Texas has a vulnerable coastline to sea level rise. And if you look at the large cities, they may be far away from the coast, but if you look at their elevation, they will be swallowed up by the rising sea level, and Texas at some point will wake up to that fact. And so they will have an interest in formulating alternative energy futures. The West in California, geothermal in some parts, solar, including Arizona, Nevada. Nevada, the federal government could actually move the whole of Nevada towards renewable energy and export the stuff from Reno to San Francisco along the existing power lines, train lines, and there's actually electric mobility infrastructure still left from the 70s. They could do that basically because the federal government and tribes control so much of Nevada. The state government needn't be asked if you wanted to do it there. So California could drive that process, and the rest of the West could come along, and it could be done. The hardest one is the Rust Belt and perhaps the Southeast. The Southeast being slightly different. The Rust Belt because it wants to be an old-style industrial heartland, and that is difficult to do with these fancy new technologies like solar. It isn't real. It is not the type of engineering that the people there seem to like. But that's a transition you can make. I'm born in Dortmund, so I know what it means for a city to move from steel to something else. It's difficult.
But it worked.
It worked for me, yes. In the southeast in the US, there seems to be much more of a readiness to stick with nuclear. There seems to be a readiness to stick with shale gas. There seems to be a reluctance to develop the local renewable technologies. I'm not quite sure why that happened. Why that is, I hope that one of my next speaking tours takes me to that region so that I can understand a little bit more. If you look at the solar map of, or at the wind map of the United States, you will see that Germany, the leading country in solar energy for a while, I don't think we still are, now it's China, actually has the same insolation on average as Alaska does. The contiguous 48 have much more sun coming down on the territory. When you look at the wind maps, the wind speeds in Germany, if you look at the legends, they stop at 6 meters a second. That is where the legends of the American wind maps start. If you look at the potential, at the resource, if you do the same with biomass, if you look at the forest, everywhere the US has more potential. And that is why I say that if you look at the gusty plains, coasts, shores and ridges of the US, you have so much wind power. If you look at the deserts in the southwest, if you look at solar potential anywhere, the US has it so much easier. The US could overtake Germany in the race to 100% renewable power. It's just that it does not do it.
In 100 years, yeah?
5 years.
No, I don't think that can be done. But,
No.
Some people would argue that the path toward that is actually not the federal government, maybe even not the state government, but a confluence of community-based activities like what we have in Marin County, and then corporations building their own microgrids, right? So a la Walmart, etc. But of course, it's hard to get to scale very quickly in that sense, and you lose the competitive edge in generating the technologies.
as I keep saying, the US has technologies in that field. There's also a question of how do you finance that? In Germany, the wind parks started. The first wind parks, they were local landowners, some city folks going into the rural areas, and the local dignitaries, whether they're the notaries or the dentists or whatever, anybody who had money, each one put 20,000 Deutschmarks originally in a pot, and then they built a wind plant, and they got the dividend. Financial buy-in by the local community. Anybody within eyesight of that thing could have a share in it. Most of them chose not to, but because they had the option, it meant that the whole thing was much more acceptable to the community. If you go and you see the 3 billion wind park proposals in the Plain States, there is no opportunity for the local community to buy in except get jobs, but they won't get construction jobs unless it is for the relatively simple parts, and they are only for a short period of time. And the long-term jobs and the maintenance crews that are there forever, as long as the towers stand, they are highly qualified jobs that are beyond the reach of the local rural population. They are a different species of people that come in and do that work. So there is no buy-in. So I argue that there should be an institutional innovation as well. What I would like to see, and this is just an idea, is that community foundations, which exist in a number of states and in cities in the US, collect money from the population, act as aggregators of finance, and that they get slightly preferential treatment in putting money into the pool for the investment, so that they can actually benefit from it. The same when you as a farmer in Germany get an electricity pylon on your field, it earns you 25,000 euros per year. That's the going rate today. So there are farmers who beg the power companies to come and put a line across their land, and they will persuade the local opposition that it's good to have that line, you know. Something like that. Let the people who have to live with the power lines have a financial benefit. I actually made enemies of myself when in Wyoming they proposed a 3 cents per megawatt hour, I think. Or it's $3, I can't remember. Anyway, very small tax on wind power generated in Wyoming for export into other states. They said Wyoming wants to have a piece of the tax cake of this. And people in the renewable industry or in the renewable community, they said, oh, this is evil, it will slow the development. And I turned the corner and said, no, this is right, this will actually accelerate, because it is so low that it won't affect the economics of the wind power investment, but it will give the legislators, the government of Wyoming, an interest in facilitating the building up of wind power plants and the transmission lines that you need in order to export that wind power. So find ways of sharing the benefit, the economic benefit, as long as it is also always outside investors that come in and put an eyesore in the landscape and then another eyesore to connect it, and nobody in the local community has any benefit. Then you get opposition. Allow the buy-in.
That makes sense. Other questions?
Just a comment out of Scheer's book had a chapter on that, and he said that he was describing the Desertec in North Africa that France was trying to set up. He said, you're going to get so much resistance that it'll never happen. He predicts it'll never happen because the local people don't benefit from the energy being produced. And it's the same thing here. He suggests regional things where the energy is produced regionally and it's delivered regionally, because the amount of energy lost in transmission is so great that you save money by collecting locally and distributing it locally.
Can you actually pick up on this and say a few words about Desertec, because it's not just French, and actually, I think that has changed.
Actually, the idea originally was German.
I'm sorry.
Never mind, the French love it.
I know.
The French love it for the reason that I already said it means that there is a monopoly of power generation,
right, and
there's only 3 entry points. Desertec is the dream of creating concentrated solar power plants in the desert, and in Europe that is the Sahara Desert in Africa, because that's the next large piece of desert we have. You have Arizona. You don't need to go to Mexico to do that, but Europe has to go to Africa to do it. And the idea was to create a industry worth about 400 billion euros with concentrated solar power plants. You would convert the power, you would feed that to Europe, and there are only 3 points where you can do that. One is around the Eastern Mediterranean. That means you have to involve Egypt, the Palestinian territories, Israel, Syria. You can bypass Lebanon if you like, but you can't bypass Syria. You can do one line across the through the Mediterranean to the sort of the foot of Italy, and you can go through the Strait of Gibraltar, where there is actually a power line that is already there linking Spain and Morocco. So it would be 3 very big power lines. Massive power generation in North Africa, linked to the European continent, and it would actually accelerate once it is built, it would accelerate the transition towards renewable in Europe, or so the story goes. In order to complement that, you have wind power in the North Sea, you have hydropower in Iceland. Iceland has huge hydropower potential. You just need a long cable to Britain and then to Europe in order to make that useful. The idea being having a European supergrid with concentrated generation, concentrated solar power in the desert, offshore wind power wherever the weather systems allow that and the water depth allow that, and hydropower in locations where you have the potential to build big dams, and that's Iceland. The rest of Europe has already been developed. The idea was that, like that, you would have lots of economic benefits going into the volatile and demographically growing region of North Africa, and it would bring peace to that. The problem with Desertec is that it precedes the Arab Spring. So when it was conceived, it was a deal between powerful monopoly operators from the German and other European energy industries, making deals with autocrats in African countries in order to build an infrastructure. And the concept, or the risk here, is that this would be so lacking so much in legitimacy that it would actually become controversial in the countries where the energy comes from. So there would be insurgents going against that infrastructure, so the military would have to be beefed up. And on the one hand, you have the hope that this would lead to the development, the peaceful development of the whole region and facilitate its integration with Europe. There is a demographic game in that, there is a cultural dialogue game in that. But on the other side, you have the risk of this becoming critical infrastructure, critical for Europe, outside of the European continent, that would have to be protected with NATO troops permanently stationed in the hostile North African environment. So, depending on which story you buy into, you have a bifurcation of views on that. I simply don't buy into that bifurcation. I simply say it's much easier to build 100% renewables in Europe. We don't need Africa. If Africa wants to have 100% renewables, they can have it, they can build it themselves.
Right.
They have to demand themselves. The technology is available to them, at least at the levels of electrification that they require at their current stage of industrialization. They can do it themselves, they don't need us, we don't need them. If we make a deal, then it will be on the margin, but it won't be the big one. So the disadvantage of Desertec is price, 400 billion. It's time, 20 years lead time.
Right.
And the risk is monopoly power and the regulatory consequences that that can have. I think that the autonomous ramping up of renewable energy systems in Europe itself, distributed, will simply happen faster. If you give the countries in Europe 20 years to build up their renewables, then we won't need any investment in North Africa anymore.
Thank you.
We have just maybe another minute or two, and then we unfortunately close out. Any final question? No?
Well, I'll
Yeah,
throw one out there.
please, go ahead.
One of the problems that we have in the policies as they're implemented here is the short term, the short timelines. So with the tax incentives for solar, wind, and other renewables, they are updated in 2 and 3 year increments. And I spent most of my adult life in Europe, and Europeans tend to think in much longer timelines on the corporate side and on the policy side. I was wondering if you had any recommendations for us.
If you look at why the wind industry in California failed in the 1980s, it had to do with the fact that the incentives to build it up had more to do with subsidizing the initial capital outlay, whether you do that with direct subsidies, with loan guarantees, or you do that with tax rebates, it doesn't matter, but it's a subsidy for the initial investment, which is why you had wind power sitting on the ridges, wind power plants sitting on the ridges, the wind was blowing and they were not operating, because it wasn't worth repairing them for the money that they would get from the electricity produced. Germany has produced an alternative model. There is, at least now, in the beginning there were also tax subsidies that lower the cost of initial investment, but the feed-in tariff that we have today rewards successful operation of the plants, whether it's wind power or whether it's bioenergy or solar power, doesn't matter. You're rewarded if your equipment works and produces power. That, I think, is an important distinction. The other one is that the feed-in tariff, it's actually reformed every 2 years, but only at the margin. And anybody who has a project that has a start date is guaranteed the income under the feed-in tariff legislation for a set fixed period of time. We are shortening the time of guarantee now, and the guarantees are lowered, as well as the technology matures and as the renewables reach the grid parity level where they should live without subsidies and protection. But essentially somebody goes in and they know in advance what, if they operate successfully, how much they will be able to earn each year. So yes, give people time to plan. If you don't know whether you will have a tax rebate system or a subsidy next year, who is going to develop the projects? All the engineering, the planning, the buying of the land, the getting of the permits, all this needs to be done with a lead time so that you can then actually build the plant and start up within that short window that regulation, the tax regulation allows you. That is practically impossible. You're sinking too much cost into developing projects that are then not implemented. And that's a waste of resources for the economy as a whole. So a longer time horizon would be better, and the best way is simply to forget about tax breaks and think about long term. Some people think that you can use the transformation of the energy system as a stimulus. You can't. Stimulus is something that needs short-term response. It's better done in the consumer goods area. Infrastructure and energy systems are infrastructure. They have long planning cycles and they have long life cycles of the pieces of equipment. That's not something that operates as an economic stimulus. That is something that you do as a long run. So if you look at the economic crisis of 2008 and 2009, you can actually trace that. Part of the reason why Germany came out so well through that crisis is because we had the renewable energy industry. It had a stable regulatory framework. The prices didn't go down. The price of steel went down, but the price of power, of the feed-in tariff, didn't go down. So in this recession, suddenly it became economically more attractive to invest in steel powers, in wind power plants, because they became cheaper to build, and you still have the regulatory framework. So that provided for job security and actually job growth in that industry at a time when other industries were shedding labor. So think of infrastructure industries as stabilizers and not as stimulators. And I think if you turn that round and you understand the dynamics, then you automatically end up with longer time frames in order to regulate the development or stimulate the development of infrastructure investment, which I believe is different from consumer goods. If you want to have a short fillip to win your election, then do it in the consumer area, but not in the infrastructure area.
A solar panel lasts 40 years, so that gives you a long-term view.
Yeah.
Andreas, this has been formidable. Thank you so much for your time and for providing all this content and hopefully a stimulating conversation. Thank you to the audience as well for being here and for contributing. Hopefully you found it valuable and useful. I don't know if you're going to stick around for a few more minutes or whether
I'll stick around for a few more minutes. I still intend to eat this lunch.
So have mercy with them. Let's give him a hand. Thank you.
Yeah, also the name of Gaba and ACG, thanks again, Olaf and Andreas, for this very inspiring talk. And we touched on so many subjects. I really hope that you will come out again to the West Coast and we can continue this conversation, because I think we can go on like this for years and then maybe look back and say, hey, let's see what we said in 2012, and hopefully
Well, it was
in the
all
time
recorded.
Exactly,
Who
yes.
owns the rights to that recording apart from me?
Yes, yeah, we did record the session, and it's going to be up on our website if you want to see it again, or point some of your colleagues or other people to it. So, yes. Thanks for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So